Yo, what's up everybody? Welcome to another episode. I don't know if I should call this another episode. I should just call this a special episode. So I'm just gonna call this a special episode. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a special episode of of Wilkings Podcast Network. So guys, today is I have recorded this podcast today on today is 29th. So today is 29th of May 2020. So this day it's pretty much how do I say, it's so special to me. The reason why this day is very special to me is because this is actually the very day that I uploaded the first episode of Wilkings Podcast Network. And by the time I was uploading the first episode of Wilkings Podcast Network, which was last year, which was in 2019 May, at that point, the direction that my podcast was taking it was more of like a personal platform to just openly talk about my mistakes, talk about the my mistakes in a way that I am not validating myself, and in a way that I'm also not trying to like justify my mistakes. So at that point last year when I was starting the podcast, I just wanted to create a space. Like I just wanted to have a space whereby I will sorry. Like I just wanted to have a space whereby I will openly talk about 2 minutes, okay? I'll openly talk about my mistakes, openly talk about going through depression, openly talk about cyberbullying. You get, which of course it's which of course it's as a which of course is as a result of my personal mistakes. So by the time I was starting my podcast, I basically wanted to create a platform for me to just openly talk about my mistakes and just to just have conversation around cyberbullying, around mental health, around mental depression. But look at us, we've grown to now we have other shows under the podcast. So we have Tush Time Show, we have Rothschild Podcast, we have Sense Talk segment. So make sure you check out these shows. Is it here or here? So make sure you check out these shows here under Wilkins Podcast Network, and just get to see the kind of how do I say, just get to see the kind of strides we've made since episode 1, man. Like since episode 1. So happy, what is it called? It's basically our anniversary, our first anniversary. I want to say thanks to each one of you who has been part of this podcast from day one. So if you've been part of this podcast from day one, I just want to say thank you so much. And you guys, I just can't wait to celebrate 2-year anniversary. Like I really can't wait to see what the next 12 months have in store for this podcast, because the vision is big, guys. The vision for this podcast is so big. So thank you so much for all advertisers, for the partners, for the collaborators, for all the guests we've had on the show. Tush, to the team, Tushian, Kalima, Mato, Peter, Sean, Castro. Castro is Tanasha Donna's manager, very close friend of the podcast. Just everyone, like Made in Kenya Store, Alchemist, Charlie's Bistro, all amazing people and brands that we've worked together. A special shout out to Made in Kenya Store. Actually, like that's like our place. So guys, about Made in Kenya, 5 minutes. So about Made in Kenya Store, there was a time we were really struggling to get a place where I can shoot my show. Like, I was struggling. Like, I could go everywhere, ask for a place I can shoot my show, and all the answers I used to get was no. Like, I don't know. But I want to say a big shout out to Made in Kenya Store and Alchemist for allowing us for collaborating with us in terms of shooting the podcast from their spaces. Thank you so much. So yeah guys, I'm just so excited, and I really can't wait to see what's in store for the podcast. Like, guys, before I jump into another thing that I'm supposed to talk about, I have this special series that is coming up on the podcast starting this June. So this series is called Finding Myself Unapologetically. So the series involves around conversations that are more focused on personal development, that are more focused on personal evolvement, that are more focused on basically finding yourself, finding your purpose, like the small things that constitute to us finding ourselves. So the series starts June, and our first guest is actually Tanasha Donna. That's going to be our first guest for that series. The conversation are going to be more on we're not going to have a conversation around what happened between you and who, as in the conversation will just be more on what is that personal thing that we don't know about Tanasha or another person, or even myself. Like, what are the mistakes I have made in being in that position of trying to find myself. Like, personally, I have made very crazy mistakes. I have made really bad mistakes, crazy mistakes. So I'll be talking about all that kind of stuff in the series. So it's the first season is starting this June, and which will have almost 12 episodes, and the first episode features Tanasha Donna. So the series is called Finding Myself Unapologetically. So if you have a story basically on how you found yourself, if you sort of like have connected with yourself, you know yourself, you sort of like practice self-awareness. So if you're that kind of a person and you want to be part of this series, please reach out to me on please check out my email on the subscription box and my contact on how you can get to be part of this series. Now let me jump into it. Something I want to touch on, something that has been trending this week. George Floyd, man, I still don't get it. In 2020, we are still like, it's 2020, these things still happen. Like, we still have police brutality. Like, I still really can't figure it out how we have police brutality, you get. And I just don't get it how, even leave alone, let's leave the racial aspect of the entire situation out. I really don't get it why you should unachukua magoti yako unaweka kwa shingo ya msee. I really don't get it. Maze mi siget why you should put your knees on someone's neck, and the way people struggle when they're dying, like, and someone is struggling to live and you still, oh fuck, man. I saw that video and I felt really disgusted. I really don't get it. I don't get it why. I really don't get it why there's still colorism, why there's still where there's still, I don't get it, man. I still don't get it up to right now, especially America, where it is right now. like it should be in the forefront of fighting for human rights. I don't get it why still we have racism in the world. I don't get it. And I saw that video, and may his soul rest in peace. I saw the video and I felt really disgusted. So it's so bad, man. It's really, really bad. So my take is, like, it's crazy. And I just hope that justice is served to that. Hope justice is served, of course, to the family. But George Floyd situation, I hope my personal, what is it called? My personal hope is that I hope the situation, I've used so many hopes there. I hope the situation basically starts a conversation around racism, around police brutality. And police brutality just doesn't happen in the US. Even in Kenya, when quarantine was starting, we saw police using excessive force. We have seen this happening every now and then, and it happens in many countries. In African countries, it's very worse during elections. So I just hope, especially right now that the country is about to get into elections, so many countries actually, I hope this situation stirs up conversations, stirs up implementations of policies that govern human rights. I hope this situation basically, and not just even police brutality, not even rights when it comes to racism, but just general rights. I just hope I just hope this strikes conversations to like really take serious when it comes to human rights. Anyway, cool. Now I'm done with that. May his soul rest in peace, and may they find justice. Now I want to talk about something here. Now that we are celebrating 1 year anniversary for this podcast, how many minutes do we have? 13. We are now in 13 minutes. Something I want to talk about on my podcast. So someone asked me a question. The other day, someone actually asked me a question. Like, what is one bitter fact about podcasting in Kenya? About, starting a podcast in Kenya. Rule number one, or rather, let's call this list. Let's call this list 10 bitter truth about launching a podcast in Kenya. 10 bitter truth. Truth number one about launching a podcast in Kenya. Just quickly. And please stay tuned for another episode. Now, for the next episode after this, I'm going to basically take you through launching now the podcast in Kenya. Now, for this one is just basically 10 bitter truth facts that you really need to know before launching a podcast in Kenya, or about launching a podcast in Kenya or Africa, right? So, truth number one, you'll always be your own audience. Like, when you're starting the podcast, it's very lonely. It's a lonely place. It's a very lonely place in a way that, podcast, especially if you're just doing only audio, like before you even get to 10 listeners, 20 listeners, 30 listeners, fact is you're going to be the only one always listening to your podcast, right? So how do you move from being the only one listening to your podcast? So now that's where it involves making sure you have right digital strategy, have the right branding, make sure you know how to build up your own audience, like all these small things, which I will talk about them on the next I think on another video, probably next week. Number two, so probably like one, especially if you don't have numbers, getting your first hand, let's just say if you first hand listeners, it's not gonna be easy. It's not easy. So be prepared. It's gonna take you, for others, it's gonna take you almost a month for you to have 100 listeners. So that's why it's important for you to have a very strong digital footprint for your own personal brand, so that when you're starting these things, it's easy for you to like, it's easy for you for people now to like get into your to start watching your content. So it's not easy. So number one is it's not easy building up your audience and building up, having that one first 100 listeners. Number two, quickly, your audios will suck. If you're doing your podcast in audios or both audios and videos, your first episodes will always suck. Even if you have dope camera, if you have like really nice I don't know, like the first episodes will always suck, like the first episodes. And it's utakuwa na kismat if episodes za kwanza zinaanza kupata viewership, you get like, hey, mazapo uko na kismat. If your first episode starts getting listenership, hapo uko na kismat. Oh, by the way, as we're celebrating our anniversary, we are proud of 60,000 views and 100,000 listeners. So thank you all. Thank you. That's close to around 300,000 audience. Almost 500,000. Anyway, is it 300,000? Yeah, almost 500,000. Yeah. So number two is your first episodes will suck. And the fact is, even if you have like the best whatever, the first few episodes will suck. Like 80% of people who get into podcasting, first few episodes always suck. So get over it. If you're creating a podcast and you don't like the episode, you don't like your first episode, upload it. Be proud of that episode, because it's your episode. Because at least you've started, at least you've taken that step. You've started your podcast, all right? That's number two. Number three. Number three is 90% of people you write to when it comes to collaborating on your podcast, whether they are advertisers or collaborating with a certain organization or company, 90% of the responses you'll get is 1, let me look into it. 3, talk to us after like 5 months. 4 is we will get back to you. We will get, yeah. And the reason why they'll say they'll get back to you is 80% of those responses is because they don't understand how to package, how to basically market their products and brands in podcasts. So it's not, don't take no offensively when you approach someone to collaborate with, advertiser and all that kind of stuff. Don't take it personal. Please don't take it personal. It's just because podcast is a pretty new thing in Africa and Kenya. So for them to be responsive positively to collaborating, to putting the advertisement on your podcast, they need to understand. And so it's gonna be lucky if you're pretty good in terms of doing your pitch, in terms of pitching your podcast to potential advertisers and collaborators. Like utakuwa yani uko na bahati ukipitch, then all of a sudden you start getting advertisers. Now with that point, I want to say thanks so much to our advertisers who have been advertising on the podcast. That is Absa Kenya and what else? Absa, Mizuna, Made in Kenya Store Alchemist. So thank you so much for all the people who have been advertising on the podcast. Anyway, point number 4. Is it number 4, number 5? Another thing about starting a podcast in Kenya is please, you will always be your own marketer. Like, don't expect, even your friends, don't expect your friends to share your podcast. Even your family. Like, if they're gonna share, well, but don't expect anything from anyone. Like, don't expect anything from someone when you're starting your podcast. when you're trying, let me repeat that point. It's 20 minutes, so I'm gonna leave it there. The other points, I will finalize the other points on another special episode that is coming up on how to launch a podcast in Kenya or Africa, right? So this one is just basically few tips. So other tips will come next week, I promise. Next week I will upload few more tips, because I just want this video to be only 20 to 30 minutes. Anyway, the last one is, which is very important, is when you're starting your podcast or before launching your podcast, one bitter fact that you need to know is that don't expect anything from someone. Don't. Because people will disappoint you. Whether videographer, whether your graphic designer, whether someone who's doing marketing, don't expect anything from someone. If people are going to share your podcast, well and good. Of course, tell them to share. Of course, you have to. But if they're gonna share, well and good. If they don't share, don't take it personal, because you don't owe anyone anything. You don't owe anyone anything. That's the bitter fact about content creation. So don't expect anything from anyone. Make sure you start with what you have. And the good thing about podcasting, which I will leave my point, I'll stop my point here, is you can start with only your phone. You can start your podcast with only your phone and a mobile application. That's the good thing about podcasting. Like, you don't need a fancy camera. You don't need, unless you're doing both audio and videos, which is what I do. I do a podcast both in videos and audios. So please don't, last point, which is very important and which I've come to learn. Your friends will say, oh, I love your podcast, oh, it's a nice thing. Don't even take that seriously, because it may not be genuine. Not everyone is happy for you that you've started your podcast. All right, like, just don't take anything to your heart, and don't take things personal. If people don't share your podcast, or people don't listen to your podcast, if your friends don't share your podcast, if your family don't share your podcast, come on, don't be worried about that, because it's just how we are. For us human, we are wired like that. We want to support people once they start making it. When they don't make it, we don't support them. So don't expect anything from someone. Start with your phone. Next week, remember, next week I am uploading a special episode on how, like a very 30 minutes episode on how to launch your podcast in Kenya and Africa. And also please take note that we are offering services when it comes to podcast setup or content creator. So if you're trying to launch your podcast in Africa or in Kenya, please reach out to us. We're offering those services, from branding to conceptualization to marketing to recording. Don't worry, even if you're far away from Kenya, we still can offer the services. We have our own ways on how we do those things. So thank you so much for tuning in. Please make sure you stay tuned for a special episode next week on how to launch your podcast in Kenya. Next week I'm bringing you a really amazing full episode on how to launch your podcast in Kenya and in Africa. Meanwhile, bitter fact number 1 is that you will always be your own audience. All right, so don't expect that you start your podcast and you hit 100 listeners in a couple of few months or few weeks. Number 2 is make sure you understand your audience. Make sure you understand your content. Like, not everyone, I don't even know if that was the point, but again, I think it's important for you to, before you launch a podcast, it's important for you to get to understand I'm rushing because it's almost 30 minutes and I wanted this episode to be only 30 minutes. So make sure, one bitter fact is that you're not guaranteed of an audience. Before you get 100 listeners, it's not going to be easy. I think the last one that I can't really remember all the points. It was just from my head. The last important one was the world doesn't owe you anything. So don't expect anything from anyone. build your podcast assuming like you're the only audience, you're everything. You're paying yourself, you're like, just assume you're everything, so that when, just in case someone disappoints you, you don't take it to your heart. Anyway, I see it's 25 minutes. So Maze, one thing I've learned about launching a podcast in Kenya, like, it's a new thing, it's a new industry, which I will tackle much about it next week, with data, with analytics, with everything. I'll back up the data. And oh, by the way, we what do I say, when you're trying, one thing that I've learned when you're trying to start your podcast in Kenya is that most times people will say they like your podcast after they see it's doing well. Once it starts doing well, that's when everyone is like, I love your podcast, I like your podcast, I love your podcast, I like your podcast. So that's what's up, Maze. Thanks so much for tuning in, thanks so much for subscribing. This was just a random or a special episode based on what I've so far learned from launching a podcast in Kenya, which I will do full episode next week, like a 30 minutes episode dedicated to how to launch a podcast in Kenya. So please make sure you subscribe, make sure you comment, make sure you share, make sure you like, and please let me know in the comment box, what do you want me to address next week on that special episode? What do you want me to talk about when it comes to launching a podcast in Kenya? What do you need to know? Or even like, what really do you need to know? So thank you so much. This was great. Cheers and happy new month. Thank you. Bye. And I even haven't had my soda.